Chapter 11. Trailer Park Heaven was just as I'd imagined it. Creepy, garbage-strewn, with the telltale signs of neglect, apathy, and poverty apparent as far as the eye could see. Desuetude and degradation permeated the air. Fair-haired, snot-faced, foul-mouthed kids in dirty dungarees darted between the immovable abodes on wheels as the sun took refuge in the west. The general U.S. population is in complete denial, and abroad people just don't realize how many truly poverty-stricken souls of all hues live in El Dorado. It took me a while to locate Sloane's last known whereabouts. A long-since-defunct lawnmower marooned in a sea of knee-high crabgrass and a lopsided, rusted-out mailbox marked the spot. I approached cautiously. It was a good thing that there was still a little daylight left. I knocked on the flimsy screen door and stepped back on high alert. .45 caliber steel barrel bucking at the bit, snapping and a-snarling in its concealed confines.
"Who is it?"
Screeched an annoyed, raspy female voice from somewhere inside. It was, however, the master of this fine abode who greeted me at the door. A living caricature of the proverbial indigenous red-necked sloth, beer paunch prominent beneath a filthy stain-covered T-shirt, unshaven jowls afrown.
"What do you want?"
he asked, glaring at me warily without opening the screen door.
"I'm looking for Earl Sloane," I said, slipping back into my drawl. "He don't live here no more, and I don't know where he is," he said, taking a step back, his right hand edging slowly over to where he most likely had a loaded weapon. "And don't care, neither," he continued morosely without losing eye contact. "I'm looking for someone with an 18-wheeler for hire," I said. "5 trailers down on the right. Ask for Clem Samuels," he said, and left me to my own devices. Mr. Samuels turned out to be a considerably more affable soul than my previous interlocutor. He explained that his 18-wheeler had been recently repossessed, with only 18 months to go on the payments, and that he, being a God-fearing man, considered repo men to be devil worshippers, plain and simple. When I inquired as to Earl Sloane's possible whereabouts, his frown and demeanor betrayed the fact that Sloane held an even higher position on his totem pole of contempt and disdain than did repo men. "That man ain't no good. I'd steer clear if I was you, mister," and began his retreat, adding that Sloane spent a lot of time at King's Pool Hall, cross town. I crossed town presto pronto so as to reconnoiter King's renowned gaming establishment. As I grew nearer, I realized that this was a considerably more ethnically diverse neighborhood than one might expect down south. This was something you really didn't see much of in the Southland, generally speaking, and it usually spelled double trouble. Contrary to popular pipe dream belief, America is not a country that truly embraces racial harmony, and that goes for both sides of the fence, something I tend to forget living on the jazz scene in cosmopolitan New York City. When 20% of a national population represents 80% of the carceral population, there's definitely something very wrong with that demographic picture. Well, we've got Obama now, which is a good thing, I suppose, even though he's not really making good on all his campaign promises. No politician ever does. No politician ever can. It's the nature of the game. Especially when you're being cock-blocked by the entire Republican Party, a viciously evil and poisonously powerful political entity apparently only comprised of pig-headed sociopathic idiots on a single-minded malicious crusade of systematic sabotage and slander hell-bent on keeping people of color beneath the underdog at all costs, as America and the undead Aryan nation make another mad dash towards world domination and total planet plunder with renewed and refurbished fanatic fervor. I'd kind of figured he'd be up against a brick wall, having long grown disillusioned with politics and humanity in general. Anyway, who'd have thunk it a few years ago? At least it's cool not to be completely ashamed of the commander-in-chief for a change. It sure wasn't as if he'd inherited a rose garden, more like a royal shitstorm. The babe was scared all right, and cold too, bound and gagged and ironically seated on her own couch. Well, she most def was going to give it up.
if that's all he wanted. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to be his full agenda. She thought, regaining her cool a little, a very bad feeling gnawing relentlessly at the pit of her stomach, and a cold sweat dampening her brow. Chapter 12. As I entered King's, my eyes adjusted to the lighting unique to pool halls everywhere. Green felt-covered tables filled the room, each illuminated by cones of yellow light produced by two suspended overheads, encasing each table in its own blanket of near darkness. There were about 20 tables, but only 5 games going, which I guessed was par for the course on a Tuesday night. The place was eerily quiet, as are most serious pool establishments. No background music, minimal and hushed conversation with only the percussive sound of cue balls impacting their targets prominent. The scene solicited a strange pagan reverence. I ordered a beer at the bar and observed the games from a distance, projecting the image of a lone and desultory cowboy, sporting a Stetson brim down low, snakeskin boot shod, playing it cool, knocking back a few cold ones, discreetly keeping my eyes on the entrance. There were 2 hustles and 3 serious games of 9-ball going, the technical ability of our protagonists being quite impressive. They were clearing tables fast, sinking bank shots consistently and never missing an easy shot. Definitely some high-level pool. This place was no joke. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw Small stroll in with a polyester-suited sucker in tow. Probably a low-budget itinerant salesman of some kind. I lowered my brim and turned toward the bar, averting my gaze and avoiding his. He didn't notice me and headed straight for an open table with his patsy in close pursuit, and proceeded to lose the first 2 games for peanuts, pretending to be flustered at his own performance. Small wasn't much of an actor, but the mark was eating it up big time, and gaining confidence way too quickly. The ante was upped, and Small lost again, but this time just barely. It was time to go in for the kill, and Small took him for 5 bills in 4 consecutive games of 9-ball, a Benjamin a game, the last one being double or nothing. The mark left forlorn and destitute with his tail held firmly between his shaky legs. Small was no Rhodes Scholar, that was a given, but he sure had game. Small walked up to the bar with a smirk on his face and ordered a beer, turning towards him, pushing up my brim. "How's it hanging, Small?" He convulsively choked on his beer, made complete with repulsive nose fountain squirts, the remnants of which he summarily sopped up with his right sleeve, eyes almost popping out of their sockets. His scrawny brain had just overloaded to the point of near meltdown. He just gaped at me slack-jawed with an idiotic expression painted across his pathetically ugly-ass mug. What the fuck are you doing here, West?" he stuttered, gauging the distance to the door. "That's just what I was going to ask you," replying calmly, savoring his undeniable discomfort with relish. The bolt to the door rumbled, and the parking lot floodlights poured in, momentarily blinding her. As she refocused, she noticed that there was a very imposing middle-aged black man in flashy brand-name sportswear standing behind Sloane. He gave her the once-over, nodded, and walked away. Sloane sidled up to her and whispered, "Some people will pay good money for white meat. You know what I'm saying, darling? So you better be a good girl or else. You get me, sweet cheeks?" Ava wanted to spit in his face, but wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of visibly panicking. She was a tough cookie and knew what was coming. She just hoped that big man would be gentle. Where the fuck was Nick when she needed him? A cowering Small unwillingly accompanied me to my truck. We had a nice talk in which the leverage was all in my favor. I explained to him how it would most certainly be in his best interest to help me locate a certain Earl Sloane, who frequented King's regularly. The alternative being that I advised the proper authorities as to his present whereabouts. And we both knew that that wasn't a viable option. We discussed the Biggie versus Manny debacle. Then I told him of Biggie's demise at my very own hands, which shook him up to the brink of apoplexy. He paled visibly and started to shake a little as he explained that Biggie's crack habit had gotten way out of hand. and that he'd totally wigged out. That was really all there was to it as far as he was concerned. He split that scene because he most certainly would have been implicated and had feared Biggie's exponentially growing crack-fueled madness. I wasn't so sure he was on the level, but I'd take his word for it. For the moment, anyway. Crack addiction is a worldwide epidemic on a par with that of heroin and methadone at this point. An altered mind and body pandemic of mammoth proportions which not only affects ghetto youth, but one that permeates all stratas of society on an international scale. As far as I'm concerned, all crack suppliers and producers should be publicly drawn and quartered. There are already enough problems on this blue-green earth of ours without all that nastiness. Drugs of the sort are a lot like power and money. They corrupt multilaterally. Small had assured me of his cooperation when I dropped him off at his sister's place, reminding him none too subtly that he was between a rock and a hard place. I gave him an untraceable cell number where he could reach me and bade him good night, knowing very well that he wouldn't sleep a wink. I parked around the corner and waited an hour to make sure he didn't bolt. It was 11:45 when I reached the motel. When she hadn't returned by 2 a.m., I was sweating bullets. I should have never let her go off on her own. What had I been thinking? She was a hard-headed woman who never took no for an answer, making even friendship an arduous task at times. A good night's rest was no longer on the agenda. Yeah, right. I'd call my buddy Laramie first thing in the morning and tell him Miss Morris had disappeared and that Sloane might have something to do with it. He'd put it somewhere on his roster of things to look into that day, but she wouldn't be an official missing person for another 48 hours. A lot can happen in 48 hours, not to mention that she had never been in the good graces of the Memphis Sheriff's Department. It would not be a priority in anyone's eyes except mine. I grabbed my keys, my Dirty Harry, a nickel-plated .45 named Betsy, and headed for the door and a night of truck-stop cruising in search of my damsel in distress. When Ava's blindfold had been removed after a 20 or so minute ride, she found herself seated inside a nondescript, seedy motel room. Sloane had removed all her restraints and told her to relax, take a shower, and make herself comfortable. "If you make a break for it or start a commotion, I'll fuck you up real good, in ways you can't see. Believe you me," he super creep whispered with a palsied, psychotic leer. There are plenty of ways of hurting someone without leaving a blemish. He gave her some clean clothes and told her that the John would be there within half an hour. He left her alone under lock and key. This totally sucked. There was no way out. She knew she was going to have to bite the bullet on this one. She took a shower, stifling an almost overwhelming urge to weep. Stiff upper lip, that's what the Brits say, she thought. She was one tough broad, all right. I canvassed truck stop A and B with a phony badge and a photo of Ava. Yes, she'd been there a few hours prior, and no one knew where she'd gone, was the consensus. A few booths down sat a large, heavy-set black man who just didn't fit in somehow. He was dressed a tad too casually for his self-important bearing. He was trying too hard not to be noticed, which made him very noticeable indeed. I found this a little puzzling and kept an eye on him. He kept glancing out towards the parking lot. A car pulled up, flashing its lights twice. He got up hastily, left a tip, and headed for the door with a little too much pep in his step. I did the same, slowly passing by, peeping the driver's side as Mr. Casual opened the passenger door and the lights came on. Bingo! Sloane was at the wheel. I continued on my trajectory. It was way too easy, which meant slippery when wet, dangerous curves ahead. All my senses were on alert as I followed Earl's Mustang through sparse traffic. When he pulled into the Motorola Motel, I kept on going a couple of blocks and doubled back. Sloane was sitting in his car smoking a cigarette, cocksure of himself and oblivious to my arrival. I broadsided him fast, flashing a phony badge, sporting my brim down low, mirrored pilot's glasses glued in place. "License and registration, please," I said with convincing authority. "I'm just waiting on my girlfriend," he said, nonplussed, handing over the required documents. "Please step out of the vehicle now, sir," I said with the appropriate mixture of civility and menace, to which he begrudgingly complied. As soon as he got out of the car, I brass-knuckle sucker-punched him hard, feeling his nose crumble as he stepped back. I spun him around and slammed his face into the car roof. He buckled, and I cuffed him again, cracking his head one more time for good measure. He went out like a light. I disarmed and bundled him into the rumble seat of his own vehicle, then headed towards the motel, spotting only 2 rooms with lights still on. Thumbed off the safety, on a collision course with door number 1, Peacemaker ready, willing, and able. Mr. Casual told Ava to strip, lie down, spread 'em, and play with herself. He left the lights on and proceeded to undress methodically, folding each piece of discarded clothing and placing them carefully on the only chair in the room. His big black snake hung halfway down to his knee and was starting to stir. The babe was impressed by his dimensions and getting a little aroused in spite of herself. This might not be so bad after all, she was thinking when she heard a commotion a few doors down. He knelt on the bed and started priapic predator closing in for the kill. I kicked in door number 1 only to find a scrawny-assed middle-aged hillbilly fondling some even scrawnier jailbait. He was about to get indignant, so I cuffed him hard with nickel-plated steel and told him to shut the fuck up, holding up my phony badge. He wet himself and acquiesced sheepishly. Somebody had probably heard the ruckus by now. Had to move fast. I approached door number 2. Another swift kick. The door flew open. I burst in, weapon raised, to find an extremely surprised Mr. Casual buck naked on all fours and quasi-erect over a supine spread-eagled, equally surprised Ava. Not a pretty picture from behind. I told him he was under arrest, once again flashing my phony badge. He started to mumble, "I should have known better," to himself, with a hitch in his basso profundo. Ava was having a hard time keeping a straight face. "Okay, I get it. This is some kind of scam. How much do you want?" he asked, swallowing his mortally injured pride in massive gulps. "It ain't like that, bucko," I said. "Get dressed, grab his phone and clothes, and let's scram, sweetheart," I said, keeping a bead on the crestfallen Mr. Casual, who looked none too happy about the situation, to say the least. We were out of there in no time flat, leaving Mr. Casually unlucky to his own devices. "Sometimes you get what you pay for, and sometimes you don't." In this case, I'd say both, was heard over my shoulder as we made our exit triumphantly. As we headed for my truck, I immediately noticed that Sloane's Mustang was nowhere to be seen. Damn, that mofo could take a licking and keep on ticking. Annoyed but impressed. Would get to him later. First things first. Had to get the babe back to the motel safe and sound. As we drove back across town, I kept an eagle eye on my rear view mirror to make sure that Sloane, or anyone else for that matter, wasn't in hot pursuit. So far, so good. At least I hadn't had to shoot anybody. I got a call from the mayor on the bat phone. He sounded somewhat distraught. Apparently, Miss Philippines had been found dead 2 days after the party. Death by asphyxiation was the coroner's report. He wanted to see me yesterday. "No can do, boss. Don't call me, I'll call you," I said and hung up. That must have pissed him off plenty, being overly accustomed to yes-men, but everything in life is a question of priorities. Any bitch will tell you that you've got to know when to play hard to get. My priorities at the moment were the babe, Sloane, and those 25 keys of splifferoonie. The following evening around 8 p.m. I got a call from Small, who was so excited that he could hardly articulate a coherent sentence. But he managed to convey that Sloane was at the pool hall right at that very moment. "And his face is seriously fucked up, all bandaged up and shit." I wasted no time getting over there and parked a few doors down. I had changed rental vehicles the day before. I was waiting in a blue van with a construction worker's outfit on and a phony beard that smelled slightly of gum arabic. Disguise is an important part of my job. Never use the same one twice, especially once you've been made. I knew that Sloane must be gunning for me by now, and he sure wasn't going to fall for that cop routine twice. Earl strutted out 2 hours later with way too much swagger and a little too much weave. It appeared that our man was pretty deep into his cups, which was going to make things a lot easier, but I still had to be careful because he probably had a piece tucked away somewhere. I decided to hit and not run, pulled out fast, clipping him good, sending him sprawling to the ground hard and heavy. Backed up, door open, training Betsy on him. "Do you need a lift, partner?" He just stared at me in dazed disbelief. "Get the fuck in, Sloan, and leave your weapon on the sidewalk. I'm not playing, motherfucker. I'll pop you in a heartbeat." Something in my tone of voice told him that he didn't have many options, not to mention the fact that the generous amount of whiskey that he'd just consumed had most likely somewhat clouded his relatively rudimentary cognitive ability. He complied reluctantly after picking himself up painfully. As soon as he'd climbed in, I put his lights out again with a swift gun butt upside the back of his head. He slumped forward. I seatbelted him in and pulled out fast without burning rubber. Breeze Inn motel bound, Betsy at the ready, grip slick with sweat. When I arrived with the barely conscious Sloan in tow, Ms. Morris took one look at him and kicked him in the nuts as hard as she could. He groaned mezzo forte and went slack. "Easy, precious. He's got to be able to talk," I said. I sat him in a chair while the babe trained my backup .38 in his general direction. "You can put the gun down now, honey. We won't be needing it anymore," I said after I'd finished duct taping him to a chair, my voice equally imbued with post-violence anxiety, fatigue, and seriously righteous relief, as the day's drama drained away slowly. I then proceeded to pour a wastebasket full of motel ice water over his head, which brought him to pretty damn quick. The interview didn't last long. After all the punishment he'd received during the past few days, he didn't waste much time revealing the location of his rig. Bound and gagged in the dark except for the boob tube blaring inanity at high volume, which made his severely concussed no-account noggin pulse mercilessly with pain. The bitter taste of his own medicine gnawing away at his gut. Locked in a room, do not disturb sign in place. Every once in a while, evil gets as evil does. By the time we found the infamous 18-wheeler, it was dawn. We drove it to a self-storage facility and unloaded her life's possessions. When we got to the book trunks, we were very relieved to find that the mother lode of Skanky was still intact. We returned to the motel to find a very disgruntled Earl sitting in a pool of his own urine. We retired to Ava's room for a little R&R and some greasy spoon room service, awaiting nightfall and the coup de grace. Sloan was going to fall, and fall hard, 3-time loser hard. When the time was right, I threw Sloan into the back of the van and we drove to a remote location near where we'd parked his rig. We seated him on a chair made from 5 keys of pure hemp and lashed him to a tree after making him sign over ownership of his rig to a certain Clem Samuels, and hung a citizen's arrest sign around his neck. I called Laramie at the sheriff's department and tipped him off as to Sloan's present location. It was time for me to get back to the Big Apple, and it was time for the babe to get out of Dodge. No long goodbyes. We headed our separate ways, knowing we'd never lose touch.